man is sitting at an intersection. He's sitting down at an intersection. He's holding his hand out like this. And he's dressed in ratty, dirty clothes. He looks impoverished, probably homeless. And he's sitting at the intersection with his hand out. And the first man comes along and sees the man sitting at the intersection with his hand out. And the man thinks, here is a poor, maybe homeless person begging, wants money. So the man digs into his wallet, takes out a $5 bill, hands it to the man who's sitting with his hand out, says, God bless you, and goes on his way. Second man comes along, sees the man sitting at the intersection with his hand out, and the second man thinks to himself, this guy is begging. He's impoverished, dirty, probably homeless, but I don't want to give him money because he'll probably use it on drugs and alcohol. So what I'll do is give him my food. I have my lunch. So the second man, into the man seated, his outreached hand, hands him the bag of food, says, God bless you, and goes on his way. Third man comes along, sees the man sitting at the intersection, sees his dirty, ratty clothes, thinks to himself, the man is impoverished, maybe homeless, he's holding his hand out, I wonder what he wants. And the third man goes up to the man seated on the ground and says, what do you need? Do you need help? And the man on the ground says, yes, I fell down and I need someone to help me up. It's a common mistake, isn't it? We see people all the time at intersections, looking ratty and ragged. Now, if you're holding up a sign, they're communicating their need. But here's the difference between these three guys. The first two people, the first two men, saw the man at the ground with his hand out and made a judgment about him. They made a judgment, and without engaging him, without talking to him, they acted on their judgment. They made a calculation in their minds, and they acted on it. Went on their way. But it's only the third man who actually, now granted, the man on the ground is a lunch and $5 richer than when he started, but it's neither lunch nor $5 that he really needed. What he needed was somebody to help him up. And what's different about the third man is that he asked the question, what do you need? Do you need help? Tell me how I can help you. He approached the man with curiosity. Here's another story. A spouse comes home late at night, after dinner, let's say, comes in, the whole family is upstairs. He hasn't eaten yet, or they, let's call it just a spouse. I don't want to assign gender here, because then we'll start making all kinds of judgments. So the spouse comes in, hasn't eaten dinner yet, the whole family is upstairs, sees in the sink a bunch of dirty dishes. The spouse thinks to themselves, why do I live with these people? They're slobs. I've been at work all day, it's late, I haven't eaten yet, and here's all this work for me to do. dishes, dirty dishes, left in the sink. And what this spouse chooses to do is to make themselves something to eat for dinner, to clean up their own dishes, to clean up the mess they made, and just leave the dishes in the sink. Because I'm not going to be bullied or manipulated in my marriage. Interestingly enough, in the same neighborhood, at the same time, another spouse comes home, different spouse, different family, same situation. Their dishes in the sink, sees the dishes, thinks, why do I live with such slobs? Is this really here for me to do? And this spouse goes upstairs, finds their spouse and says, what are all the dirty dishes doing in the sink? And the spouse, who's already in bed, says, don't worry about them. Don't worry about them. I've had a long day. I'm exhausted. I'm going to get up and I'm going to do them in the morning. Don't worry about it. The first spouse sounds a lot like these first two guys who came along with the man. Makes a judgment, but doesn't just make the judgment. Notice what these three people have in common. The man who gives $5, the man who gives the meal, and the man who, or the spouse, we don't want to call it a man, I was just being rhetorical, right? The rule of three in rhetoric. But our first spouse, who could be whomever, right? That what they have is not only do they make a judgment without data, but then they act on it. I see the man sitting at the intersection, I make a judgment about the man at the intersection, and then without engaging with the person, I make a judgment and react. I come home, I see dirty dishes in the sink, and I don't ask, I don't inquire, I just make a judgment, and then I act out. I'm going to clean up my dishes, but I'm going to leave your dishes. Sounds like a marriage made in heaven. But it's pretty common. It's pretty common. These are just examples. And the difference is the third man who comes along, as I said before, responds from curiosity. From curiosity. What do you need? The second spouse who comes home responds with curiosity. Instead of just making an assumption about what's happened and then judging the character of one's immediate family, instead of the judgment and the acting out, responds with curiosity. What are all those, what's up with the dinner dishes? What's going on? Oh, don't worry about them. Don't worry about them. Or it could be, I left them for you. Because, yeah, it could happen. Don't raise your hands. At 8 o'clock, no kidding, we had one couple sitting, and one spouse just went. I see you when I'm up here chatting, and I learn a lot. But I don't make judgments. But my curiosity does get piqued, no question about it. Sometimes we can be curious and not get the answer we're looking for. But the difference is then at least we have information. Now I know. I'm not just acting based on my own snap judgment. Now you may be wondering, why this morning are we talking about the human inclination to judge, to see and to judge without engaging? And that is one of our choices. The other is curiosity, to respond with curiosity, to ask and then act, to ask and then choose. This morning, our gospel is all about divine love. And divine love is too big a topic to take on in one sermon. So an element of divine love is curiosity. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, is that really? Well, if we want to understand God as Christians, we look to Christ. We look to Jesus. We look to Jesus' witness in the Gospels. And one of the things we notice about Jesus almost always responds with curiosity. A leper comes up to Jesus. Now think about a first century leper, right? Like somebody just opened the ark. Their face is slipping off. I was wondering if this congregation was going to get that reference better than the 8 o'clock did. Do you know what I mean when I say open the ark? Indiana Jones, right? Okay. Leprosy, not attractive. Okay, smells. Somebody comes up to Jesus, if you're a leper, that's going to be hard to hide, right? You go to the makeup counter at Macy's, you're still going to look like a leper. And so the leper comes to Jesus. It's in the Gospels a couple times. Leper comes to Jesus, and Jesus, we see, responds in the same way our third man did this morning. Instead of just presuming, here's a leper, I'm Jesus, the leper wants to be healed, which would be more efficient. Because then Jesus could be like, you know, like when sports people do the high five and they run through, then Jesus could just heal by running through and tapping people. But it's not what happens. No, what does Jesus say? The leper comes up to Jesus. What does anybody, what does Jesus say? What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? A blind man comes up to Jesus. It could be self-evident what the man wants, but notice what Jesus does. Jesus says to the blind man, just as to the leper, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus approaches people with curiosity, not with assumption or judgment, but curiosity. Think about the story of the woman taken in adultery. They bring her to Jesus to judge her. And what Jesus does is inquires in curiosity. What's going on here? What's happening? What's the situation? Let me be clear about what's going on. And then notice Jesus doesn't judge her. Jesus says, okay, the law says she should be killed. So therefore, any of you who don't have any sin, go ahead, have at it. It's not just curious, it's creative. A young man comes to Jesus in the Gospels and says to him, my brother won't share the inheritance with me. Tell him to give me my share of the money. And Jesus says something remarkable to this young man. Anybody remember what he says? Who made me judge over you? Who made me the judge over you? Okay, Jesus is a rabbi, schooled in Torah, knows the law, but that's not a role Jesus is going to play. Your inheritance? Isn't it funny how olden times people used to behave? Like when somebody in a family would die, leaving money, and the descendants would fight over it. If only the Bible was full of real-life stories that we might be able to relate to. Jesus says, that's not why I'm here. This is not my role to judge you in this way. No. What we learn from Jesus is that Jesus approaches people, no matter how they look, how they appear to him, how obvious it may seem to you and me. He approaches them with curiosity. You tell me who you are. You tell me what you need. You tell me, how can I help you? And we hear examples. The lepers, Jesus says to the leper, what do you want me to do for you? And the leper says, Lord, if you will, make me clean. And Jesus says, I do will it. Be made clean. The blind man, what do you want to do? What do you want me to do for you, says Jesus. The blind man says, Lord, I want to see. Jesus says, your sight is restored. What do you want me to do for you? Tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance. That's not my job. Who made me judge over you? That's not why I'm here. Notice Jesus approaches with curiosity and responds in freedom to the information he receives from the people in front of him. Jesus is constantly asking questions. Asking questions. I want to suggest to you this morning that is even in the 21st century, that is a radical way to go through life. To be someone who asks questions. To ask questions. Wow. Think for a moment. Well, let me tell you this story. I'm going to tell you this story now. I said earlier that Jesus almost always responds with curiosity, but not always. There's a powerful story. It's in Mark and it's in Matthew. We find Jesus way far away from home. He's gone out of Judea, through Galilee, all the way up into modern-day Syria, out to the coast, to the area of Tyre and Sidon, what was ancient Phoenicia. So he is far from home, very much in the land of Gentiles. And we don't know what Jesus is doing out there, but there he is. And do you remember the Syro-Phoenician woman who comes to Jesus? The woman comes to Jesus and says, my daughter is ill. Heal her. And then Jesus does not respond with curiosity. Jesus responds with judgment. Jesus says, we don't throw the good food to the dogs. Y'all remember this one? Not, what was that? Well, hang on, you're getting ahead of me there, Rollin. Yeah. So Jesus, right, very much locked into this mindset that the revelation of God, you're not an Israelite. You're not one of us. You're one of them. You're outside the scope of what God is doing in and through me. And I think this is one of the powerful reasons why this story is included. Even though we see Jesus respond with quite the smack, let's be honest, you're going to throw food to the dogs. She pulls the rug right out from under him, smacks him down hard, has gone down in history as the one person who took out our Lord. She says to him, yes, remember? But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. So, in that moment, who's changed? Jesus is changed. Jesus is changed in that moment. Jesus' eyes are opened in that moment. And good for him. Right? How many of us have ever acted from judgment, gotten smacked down for our judgment, and instead of having the humility to say, oh my gosh, I was so out of line, I was so in the wrong here, we double down and start rationalizing, justifying, arguing from our original erroneous point of view. But not Jesus. Jesus says, wait a minute. Maybe what God is doing in and through me, is for more than just Israel, for more than just the Jewish people. Maybe it's for everyone. And we'll see at the end of the gospel, Jesus is completely converted. Jesus says, go into all the world now. All the world. All people. There's no one now excluded from salvation affected through me. So I tell you this morning because we're human beings. And human beings are prone to snap judgments. And there are all kinds of things that trigger our judgments. You're walking through the mall, you see somebody in a t-shirt, emblazoned across the t-shirt is the person you did not vote for. You tell me you're going to have a neutral opinion of that person? You're not thinking to yourself, oh, jerk. And by the way, let that be the worst word that any of us use. But again, it's that assumption, the presumption, the snap judgment based on no real information. Divine love, an attribute, a characteristic, a way of loving, is the way of curiosity. We may not always like what we learn. We may not always agree with what we learn. We don't have to accept what we learn. But think about that first parable. Christian love is about how we relate one to another. And how much more powerful when we respond with curiosity. Curiosity opens the door to understanding. Curiosity opens the door to the possibility of greater intimacy. Curiosity takes us deeper into relationship. And so this morning, my hope is that going forward, I invite you to pay attention. Pay attention to yourselves. Pay attention this week to how you interact with those closest to you and with the strangers with whom we interact. And be mindful. Am I responding From judgment? Or am I responding from curiosity? And what might those relationships, those interactions look like? Be different. Maybe be deeper. If we can silence the judgments and ask the questions.